Kwasi has done a small piece in the newspaper about Mrs. Thatcher, and he is supremely equipped to write about her, one of the few people who has actually written about Thatcher in the past and who makes sense. And he's right that trying to apply the policies of Thatcher, trying to be Thatcher today, is trying to do something which is ill-placed and ill-judged and out of time. There's no doubt at all that Margaret Thatcher remains the most dominant post-war figure in British politics, like her or loathe her. Her legacy is still debated with fervour, and her presence looms large in the Conservative Party's psyche particularly. In 2025, not only does the year mark her centenary, but it's also the 50th anniversary of her election as the Conservative leader, and no other former Prime Minister still permeates popular culture and politics as much as the Iron Lady. Channel 4's recent drama, Brian and Maggie, a reconstruction of the infamous 1989 Brian Walden interview, is proof that the nation remains fixated on her image. And even Sir Keir Starmer, of all people, has tipped his hat to Thatcherism, invoking her financial deregulation policies in the Times, suggesting that Labour's economic strategy will mirror her free market instincts. It's a curious phenomenon. Even her ideological adversaries feel compelled to acknowledge her influence. Now, of course, that's hardly surprising, given the fact that Brian Walden, who was on the left, actually quite regularly used to go to Downing Street and have a glass of whiskey with Thatcher. But Kwasi Kwateng has done something unusual for a Conservative. He has argued that Thatcher belongs firmly in the past, and he is absolutely right. She was a product of her time, and her formative years in Grantham, shaped by her father's Methodist values, fostered an ideology of thrift, personal responsibility, and a near religious belief in economic self-determination. The Britain that she governed was one recovering from post-war stagnation, battling militant trade unions and grappling with the existential decline of its industrial base, and her policies were radical, but they addressed the crises of her era. Fast forward to today, 2025, and the conditions couldn't be more different. We live in an age ruled not by dynamic self-made individuals, but by bureaucrats, institutions, and pig-headed telephone operators and administrative states that extend beyond borders. Thatcher's worldview assumed that deregulation would unleash creativity and efficiency, but today's reality is one of Kafkaesque inertia. And you may say that was released by Thatcher. It may well have been, but it wasn't her intention. Government departments, corporations, regulatory bodies are often paralysed by their own internal mechanisms, not only in this country, but in others. With people drip-feeding information week after exhausting week, if you have to deal with any or organizational bodies, any government departments in this country or any other. In the end, it's like hitting your head against a brick wall. And I'm so tired of having to deal with the Home Office or having to deal with any of these other institutions. It doesn't matter what country it is. The people who work for and deal with the public from these institutions are incapable of constructing a coherent sentence or actually making a clear demand. Unable to act decisively or to see beyond their own procedural constraints. And that isn't Thatcher, by the way. The British economy is also structured differently than it was. The welfare state has expanded far beyond what Thatcher confronted, with the NHS alone consuming an ever larger share of national expenditure that she could not have conceived. Kwateng learned the hard way that a simplistic tax-cutting agenda, without considering spending realities, is political suicide. The modern economy is not just about liberating entrepreneurs, it's about managing a state that is woven deeply into everyday life, whether in healthcare, housing, or pensions. And rolling back the state in 2025 is not as simple as Thatcher imagined and achieved in the 1980s. Furthermore, Britain's place in the world has changed. The global landscape that Thatcher navigated was one of Cold War certainties and clear ideological divides. And today the threats are diffuse. The rise of China, the reassertion of Russian aggression, the increasing weight of economic blocs that operate with their own bureaucratic constraints, and the idea that Britain can unilaterally dedicate and dictate its own destiny through deregulation of market forces alone is the delusion of the insane. And you can sit there and listen to Kemi Badenoch throw her arms in the air and say, "It's a disaster!" It is, but it's of her making as well. The temptation to mimic Thatcher remains strong within the Conservative Party and the opposition, because everybody wants to coat-tail to a hero, to somebody who's actually achieved something. What has Kemi Badenoch achieved? Nothing. What has Starmer achieved? Nothing. Rachel Reeves? Nothing. Kwasi Kwateng? Nothing, except a reputation for being somebody that Liz Truss's ogles for his prodigious package. The temptation to coattail somebody who could actually do the job, particularly among figures like Liz Truss. Let me wave my arms in the air, who seem to believe that the mere invocation of her name can grant them ideological credibility. But Kwasi Kwateng is right. He correctly points out Thatcherism was a response to its time. Copying her policies is an entirely different matter, and in an entirely different context is not leadership. It's some sort of cosplay. It's political absurdity. The future demands new solutions. We can't apply the old solutions to modern problems. We need to deal with the reality that we've got now, not wish for something else. The world has moved on, and perhaps it's time for the Conservative Party and the Labour Party and Reform to move on as well. Perhaps it's time not only for them, but for other countries to move on and stop pussyfooting again around with these absurd bureaucratic shibboleths. It's nonsensical. In the last few weeks, I've had to deal with a lot of bureaucracy, and in fact, one of the reasons I'm slightly lame in my YouTube output today is because I'm exhausted. I am physically tired, having to deal with a number of agencies, and yes, today, bizarrely, I've spoken to a few people who seem genuinely human, and for that, I'm really grateful. But it's rare, and even they can't leverage the system to actually do something. When you're dealing with these companies, particularly people like the organisations like the Home Office, which have a principle that it takes 40 days to answer a letter, which is a simple operation. 40 days to answer a letter, and then after 60 days you get a request for further information, and then you wait another 40 days. This isn't government. This isn't efficiency. This is some sort of tyranny by paperwork. And that is beautifully described by the word bureaucracy, and not in a pleasant way. It is the mindless madness of rule by a piece of paper and by a desk. It's the mindless madness of being ruled by a plank, by a piece of wood that has no sense. It's the mindless madness of government by the lazy.